Hey everybody, I'm Aaron Simmons. This is Two Philosophers, One Conversation, where we remind each other that philosophy has always been about the public good, and we've got to do our best to make meaning in light of the fact that we are mortal beings. I'm joined today by Curt Thompson, a psychiatrist outside Washington, D.C. He's written some amazing books. I'll link to them in the description below: The Anatomy of the Soul and The Soul of Shame. He approaches psychiatry from what I would describe as a philosophical and broadly theological perspective, thinks deeply about what it means to be part of the human condition, how to engage in it in robust ways. And so I applaud his work. I appreciate what he does. And just for full disclosure, I was a professor to his very talented and amazing, impressive son, who is now working up at the UN doing amazing things. So Curt, it's wonderful to talk to you. Thank you so much for being with me.
Aaron, thanks so much for having me on. It's always a pleasure. As I mentioned earlier, Nathan said, you and I, we don't need much of a reason to get in a room and have a long conversation. So it's really fun to do this. Thank you. Since meeting and knowing you, I've just really been once again renewed in my gratitude for the significance. And I say this as somebody who treats patients and feels like at some level we're like in the real world. I mean, we're seeing people, and you are just such a breath of fresh air in reminding us about why philosophy is such an important part of who we are as human beings. That we're living, practicing philosophy, whether we know it or we don't. And so, my hope is that if we're going to be living philosophy, we need to have wise guides who can keep us from falling asleep at the wheel. Because it's what we so often are willing to do. So I'm just really grateful for you and for your work that you're doing, and not least because of the chance that our son Nathan had to be under your tutelage. So
what you're hitting on, I think, is something really powerful that motivates this program, which is philosophy is about the public good. It's about living lives of meaning and significance. Socrates said that the unexamined life is not worth living. I think that's maybe true. I'm sure that the over-examined life is unlivable. So probably somewhere in the middle is the goal. My wife reminds me of the latter often. But one of the things that I think is just so difficult right now during the pandemic is trying to figure out, how do we navigate the real psychological impact, the effects, I feel like that we're all kind of walking around with a weight, but it's like the virus. We can't quite see it. It's like we've got these bags on us pulling us down, and yet we aren't quite sure where they even are and how to throw them off. What are you finding? What are you seeing in your own practice during this time? Are the different needs shifting? Are the different concerns being varied? Or is it, the same stuff that's always been the case, just becoming more prominent?
That's right. In one of the essays, I guess the first essay that I wrote about this, I mentioned that the virus is not just a causal agent, but it's a revealing agent, right? It has kind of pulled the curtain back in my view, in no small way, on what we as late modernists how we've decided to live our lives. And I think at first there was just kind of like the shock of, we're clearly, this is a lethal invading force, the virus is, and so we've got to do everything that we can to protect ourselves against it, without really being that aware initially that this social isolation necessarily puts us literally in an embodied state that our bodies are not really able, we're not made to live like this. So one of the first things that we discover, of course, is, and we would say, well, we're lonely, or we miss people, all of which is true, but quite literally, I need to be in physical contact with people. And by that, I don't just mean hugging them. I mean, I need to be in the room to have contact, conversation, laughter, meals, all the things that we're not doing. Because in some respects, one of the metaphors I've used is, what if we were to say, look, we want you to live in an environment in which the atmospheric oxygen pressure is only like 15%, as opposed to 20%. We could do that, but we would, within a very short period of time, even though it's a very small shift, we would start to feel the impact on our bodies. This is the same thing that we're doing. We're asking ourselves to live in an environment that is unsustainable long term. And so in the meantime, we're trying to do the best we can. But what we're finding is that, everybody, we're Zoom fatigued. We go from being anxious to being irritable to being exhausted to being sad. And we are not a people. The other thing too that is true is we're not a people who are used to having a problem for which we do not have a foreseeable, hopeful solution. We believe that whatever problem we're going to face, we're going to fix this thing, and we're going to do it within a time frame that is measurable. None of those rules really apply here. So I think that what we're finding is that for those who are aware enough of the need for connection, we've said, look, it's going to be important for you to be having phone calls with people. Yes, I know that the Zoom calls are difficult, but it is going to be better that we are engaged with each other with intention. If you know of someone that you think hasn't had connection, connecting with them on purpose. It's not just that I'm connecting, it's the intention to go connect. My brain loves the notion, even if you were to say, hey, Curt, could I talk to you today? Sometimes, this is something else that I'm discovering, sometimes the amount of energy that I burn when I'm on a Zoom call with you, my body is fighting to try to get through the screen in a way that it simply can't. And so it's like that metaphor of like the cell phone is looking for a signal that it can't find. It drains its battery faster. Sometimes if you just pick up the phone and call me, I don't have the same sense of expectation if I'm on a phone call with somebody. Because my visual cues are not turned on. So sometimes phone calls can be just as connecting without being as draining. To get to your question long term, one of the things, it is becoming more difficult for people. I was just watching a report yesterday where psychiatrists, in the medical profession, when we're being trained in medical school, psychiatry is often kind of poo-pooed, by others because we're like, well, are we doing real medicine? Because we're, until, of course, now, when all the real physicians have kind of like spent their wad and their souls are out of gas. And so who are they calling? They're calling us. Right. And one of the most important things I think that will be important for us to do is that our limits, we can name our limits, and we think that, okay, so once I've told you, look, this is really hard, and you say, yes, Curt, that's really hard. It's going to be hard for me tomorrow, but there will be a part of me that thinks, I already talked to Aaron about that yesterday. He's not going to want to hear me say this again and again and again and again. And what's crucially important, I think, for us is to be able to, and this is what I think loving kindness is largely about. It is largely about being able to repetitively say and to receive other people's lament. To be able to say, this is really hard, and it actually feels a little harder this week than it did last week because I'm like, I don't like not being able to be in the room with you. To which we have to continue to come back to this and validate that, acknowledge that. And it will be in that place of continual validation. I mean, this is the essence of the Psalms, right? That they believed in a God who could take it.
Yeah.
And they just kept coming and kept coming and kept coming. We need to be able to do that in order for us then to have enough connection to be able to think creatively. Part of what's difficult about this anxiety is that it starts to erode my capacity to think innovatively. To think innovatively necessarily in this case means we're going to be taking risks.
Yeah.
And they're not pretend risks. They're real risks. But like we say, my brain is able to do a lot of really hard things for a long time, as long as it doesn't have to do it by itself.
Yeah.
And if I'm with you in this regard, if I'm connected, then I'm actually enabled to imagine creatively in ways that I typically can't, my brain can't imagine because it's too busy just trying to take care of its own state of anxiety because of its isolation.
Yeah, I mean, it's strange, the idea that in most crises, in at least recent human history, the last 50, 60 years, when we've got crises, what we do is actually double down on togetherness. I'm thinking like after 9/11, the whole, go hug your kids, hold them close, get with your neighbors, even what I thought was nonsense, the whole, go out and go shopping narrative. But yet, as stupid as that was at the level
that was nonsense.
Well, I mean, at the level of like how dumb, capitalism will save us. But what it, I think, underneath said, which is probably smart, is go be around people, find ways to be interactive, find ways to normalize the behavior that has always given you some sort of stability. And yet we find ourselves now in a crisis, and yet there's no way to normalize the frustration, because the only people that we're able to interact with are the same people over and over and over. And my wife keeps telling me, in fact, we've all got to let each other grieve in the way that we need to grieve, because my way of dealing with crisis is I drop my head and work harder, right? Like I'm oh, there's a shark, let's go punch it, right? And my wife is no, like we shut down and grieve, and then we come out of it and get back to work. And the problem is we're trying to navigate this shared social space in our house, and yet that loving kindness, finding a way to show the patience for the other person needing to navigate this slightly differently. And we've got a 10-year-old. He's navigating it fundamentally at the level of missing his friends. What are you suggesting to people at the level of, navigating this weird world, this weird embodied reality? How is it that we can begin to find some sort of, lack of a better word, health?
I think there's two threads, two rails that I would probably offer my reflected answer to that on. One has to do with just our fundamental kind of interpersonal neurobiological functions, and the other is the biblical story of the exile of the Judeans at the fall of Jerusalem. Those two ways of thinking about this, I think I've found to be helpful and have provided some ballast for how to think forward. First, from an interpersonal neurobiological perspective, I think that it is true that fundamentally, when it comes to what humans really need in order to, we have survival skills that I can, get me through. If I'm in a foxhole, I got to survive. But I wouldn't want to have to employ those particular tactics 24/7. And so when we say what are the minimum necessary requirements for some form of flourishing, and by flourishing I don't mean large GDP. We're talking about how can I have the sense, how can my 10-year-old have the sense that he's okay, that he's going to be okay. And so from the one standpoint, we would say that human beings, their fundamental kind of pillars on which we stand for flourishing. One is this sense of desiring to be known. Like I really want to be known by the other. The sense of being known is what it means to be loved. And by being known, that doesn't mean that like, I get validated and anything that I want, I get. Anything that I think is true is true. It doesn't mean that, but that I am understood, felt. So in a context, perhaps, and this happens with children all the time, and it happens with all of us, hopefully, in a context in which the other who's coming to know me is also going to ask questions. And they might even call some of my assumed storylines into question, right? Like we do with children and like my wife does with me. But this sense of, I have the sense that you really want to be in the room with me. I have the sense that you're coming to find me with all my anxiety, with all of my stuff. So that's one element of that. But the other pillar that's all part of this interpersonal neurobiological piece has to do with this notion that I believe that humans are deeply known for the purpose of creating things. I want to be known, but not just for the sake of sitting around and being known. God didn't have to give me a world to create in. He could have just, put us on clouds, right? And we could just be known for eternity. But there is this sense in which we want to make stuff. And we want to make stuff like if we're 3 or 53, we want to make things. And so, and of course, in our typical world, we have ways in which we know each other and ways in which we make things. You're a professor, but you're also a carpenter, a construction person, right?
Right.
But you're also a father. You're making a family. You're making all kinds of things. That's not as easy to do now because you're not in the classroom with your students shaping futures and lives and so forth. How can you, though, find a way to continue to make things? That's an important element that we're asking. We want to, and I think that's important. The other rail, this story of the Babylonian exile, I think is important because I have found it to be helpful because in many respects, I feel like our story mirrors that in some respects, right? We suddenly have our world turned upside down. There were people in Jeremiah's time who were saying, oh, this is just going to last for a few weeks.
Yeah.
They first said the Babylonians weren't even coming. Then they said they weren't going to siege. Then they said they weren't going to take the city. And then they said, once they're taking us off, they're not going to take us forever. They're just going to take us for a few weeks and we'll be back.
Yeah. We've got 15 cases. Pretty soon it'll be down to 0. Yeah, I've heard that story somewhere. That's right.
Right, exactly. And part of the challenge was that, of course, this was completely novel to them.
Yeah.
This generation had no idea. I mean, you can't even count the ways in which they were heading into a world that they had no way to predict until Jeremiah stepped in and said, you need to know that you are not coming back soon. Like, social distancing is here for a while.
Mm-hmm.
And so what's going to be important for you to do is to be where you are. Yeah. As it turned out for them, they were going to be in Babylon. I want you to build houses, plant gardens, get married, have kids. And when you do that, you're not just going to flourish, but you will also be an agent of flourishing for the land that you're occupying. And so, of course, this is not a perfect metaphor, but the point being is that to flourish, we need to be known and we need to have access for creativity, even in marginal ways, even in small ways. And then we need to recognize that I have this idea that life, like I hang my life on the hook of things that I can accomplish and my GDP and my this and my that and so forth.
Right.
And as it turns out, what my life is mostly about is being attuned to the present moment and being fully engaged in the moment that I have without having an awareness that like, oh, my life is going to be okay as long as I'm able to do things as I want to do them. For those of your viewers, like if we're looking for practical things, we would say, first of all, for people who, any folks who are of any kind of faith conviction, now is the time to be immersing yourself in your texts, in your prayer, in your worship. Now is the time to be physically active as you're able to be. So it's activity. It is about, of course, having contact with not just the people in your house, of course, the people that you love, but you're not sure you like anymore, right? Those people. But also, in the course of all of this, I think it's really important that we, on a regular basis, be able to name where we are. We're in Babylon, this is where we are, and we're going to lament this, because it's in the course of having somebody validate that lament and them not get impatient with the fact that we're having trouble. Like we were talking about earlier, like how do we, in our married life, when we approach these things differently, one of the ways that we create something new is because if I am a person who's like, when trouble comes, I'm a get her done kind of guy.
Yeah.
I'm not going to wait to like lament this. Like I got work to do.
Right.
I think there is something to be said for what new thing can I create by actually taking the time to lament? Because one of the things that we find is that all the energy that I'm putting into, wanting to like solve the problem, some of that energy is the energy of me running away from an oncoming train that I cannot outrun. Mm-hmm. And I'm afraid, and I'm sad, and I'm angry, and I'm all these things that I don't take the time to name. Instead, I'm too busy trying to find a solution for the problem. Mm-hmm. And we actually need to take the time to do that. In the same way that I can't just exhale, I have to inhale. Right. I don't just have I don't just have a contraction of the heart, I have a relaxation of the heart. Yeah. There is a time when I actually have to have somebody come find me. Mm-hmm. And for me to name, like, what are the things that are hard for you? And this is the thing, we tell patients, if a 3-year-old comes running to you and they're crying, you don't, for whatever reason, you don't know if they're going to be in your lap for 15 seconds or 15 minutes. You don't know. There are a ton of variables that are shaping that moment, but you're the parent, and now you're not going to be there for 3 hours, but you're going to have to let the child's need guide how long the child's going to be in your lap. And it might be 15 minutes, and you want the child to be done in 5 minutes.
Yeah.
But this is the kind of thing it is. Like, we don't know how long this is going to last. Is this a 15-second or a 15-minute gig that we're in the middle of?
Right.
And we need to know that people are going to be willing to have us in their laps for as long as it takes, being attuned to these moments, in order for us then to say, eventually at some point, what can we now do? What can we now do? And so the people who are the get or done kind of people are going to need to flex in terms of like creating more space for lament.
Yep.
And the lamenting people are going to probably have to exercise a muscle of say like, yep, it's time to get off the lap, and now it's time to go do some work.
That's been the thoroughgoing message to my students as we switched to online learning and finished the semester. Over and over and over, I kept trying to tell them, look, what mattered then matters still. The problem is, it also illustrates and highlights and brings into really fine relief that what didn't matter then probably still doesn't, right? So the idea that your whole life is defined by the task of getting a job, well, that was never true. It's important because we live in an economy and a social structure that requires working in relative, productive ways. Like, that's all true, but that what major you were picking was going to determine the rest of your life, or that internship this summer was going to dictate whether or not you were successful at 50. None of that was ever true. And
Right.
Yet when it starts breaking, the problem is we're grieving, I think at some level, we're grieving the loss of the illusion of what we thought mattered. And we're now kind of realizing, no, it never did,
Right. That is so well said. You're really touching this notion of how I think, the virus has been revealing things, right? About the things that are all true. Just like in the Babylonian captivity, there's this sense in which like, no, we need this that we have in Jerusalem to survive. And then you recognize, no, actually we don't, and we never have. People have been asking me, well, gosh, Curt, don't you think like there are those who on one side of the argument would say, gosh, like things are never going to be the same, right? And there's a certain discouraged undertone to that. And then there are those who would say, gosh, this is a great opportunity for us to become better human beings, and so forth and so on. And in both cases, they'll say like, well, aren't we? I'm hopeful for new ideas and new this and new that and so forth and so on. And I'm reminded of 9/11, and I'm reminded of how here in Northern Virginia, where we weren't in New York, but things were close to home here. And I would say for about the first 3 to 4 weeks after 9/11, just about everything that happened in the social that occurred in the social fabric of life here in Northern Virginia was palpably different. People were kinder, the pace was slower, traffic moved at a different pace. And within 6 weeks, everyday life, you'd never know that it happened. And I say, look, I think this is an opportunity for us to become aware, not of new things, because there's nothing new under the sun. It's an opportunity. It's a window, and whether the window lasts, 5 months or 5 years, the window's going to close. I'm hopeful about my future because I'm hopeful in Jesus, but I'm not hopeful because of the capacity of human beings to learn from their character flaws being revealed to them, as now is being the case. I think there will be some who with this revelation will wake up and say, my goodness, I've been living a facade. I've been living a sham. And I do not want to live that life anymore. And I think that like there was a remnant, there will be a remnant of people who come out of this time who decide that they're seriously going to live their lives more truly when all is said and done. If human beings are anything, we're consistent with ourselves, and I would, 6 years from now, we're going to be who we are.
Yeah.
And so my hope is going to be that for those people who really are seriously wanting to get after it, who like, my gosh, like I want to be a real human being.
Yeah.
They're going to listen to your podcast, and they are going to, like I say, they're going to ingest, digest, and metabolize this.
Yeah.
And that's going to take lots and lots of practice.
Yeah. Well, I told my students recently, I was like, look, y'all, when this is over, which even God forbid, if it lasted a decade, which again, on no modeling would it, but even if we made it some ridiculously long time frame, even if it lasted that long, there will be a time where it is over. And the thing is, when it's over, you say about 6 weeks. I think that's about right. About 6 weeks later, I guarantee you will find yourself in a situation wishing you had the time you had 6 weeks ago, right? Not in the sense of wish we could go back to the pandemic, but in the idea of saying we spend our lives wishing we could stay at home more. Now, this is where I get really worried about the most vulnerable and socioeconomically depressed and marginalized in our society. When I think we shouldn't miss this, I also then have to check myself and say, whoa, but for those people, there is this not anxiety about how long it will last, but anxiety about how will I get through tomorrow.
Right.
Is the message that you're saying different to that group? Like, is there, because everything we've been talking about, I'm all in. It's the sort of philosophical theoria at the anchor of our souls. This is how we go about it. This is what really matters. And I think, there are reasons why liberation theologians talk about the fact that if you're not able to get food, you probably are not also writing books about it. What is it that you would recommend? Sort of, what is the neuropsychological response for the immediate anxiety and immediate fear when you're seeing all of that normalcy abandoned, but also now immediate threats?
It's a great question, and I think back to the foundational testament of the scriptures, the Old Testament. I think has a lot to say to our sense of like those of us who read the text, and the ones who were writing the texts, and the ones who were like collecting the texts in and around just before the time of Christ, right? Within those 200 to 400 years, they were collecting all these. Those were probably not the poor people. Right? They were the educated folks. And there's a sense in which if I am in that section of the population that is standing in the bread line and that's waiting on Saturday mornings at AFAC for food for the week, my attention is about getting my family their groceries. Yeah. That's my attention. Yeah. My attention is not wondering about the people who are not getting their groceries. Right. So in some respects, one of the challenges, and we might even say this is a function of the mind, and philosophers would speak into this, that we are even having this conversation means that like this would be like, I can imagine at the judgment day, right? Where Jesus is going to ask me questions about what I did with what I had. The person who's standing in the food line, Jesus is not going to ask me questions about what they were doing. Jesus is going to ask them questions about what they were doing. And fundamentally, those are folks who also have children and who have family members that they have to treat with kindness. And their task for the day is going to be to do what they have to do to survive. Now, for me, I'm going to wonder, okay, what am I going to do to allow myself to be giving myself away? We're all doing this at some level. If we aren't having this conversation, there is no AFAC, there is no bread line, because there's no food storage for people to come to. This is not letting us off the hook. Right. It's not to say that we're heroic. It is to say that I think we have to be careful about comparing ourselves to folks in different places. Comparing myself to people who have even more than I do.
Right.
I have to ask the question, what has God given me to do in the time and space that I have with my resources? What am I doing about that? I know that I can't save everybody. And I think the same thing is true. Are people who are, in here, we have one of the largest, wealthiest school systems in the nation in Fairfax County. And part of their challenge was that they couldn't start school because they have so many students, a critical mass of students who don't have access to the internet.
Wow.
Oddly enough. And so, like, how can you do school when you don't have these kinds of kids who don't have easy access? Now, you've got plenty of kids who've got access to everything under the sun, right? Their vacations are in Switzerland. Their vacations are not to the beach.
Right.
And you have people who are at the complete and opposite end of the spectrum. What's that to say? That is to say that I want to be helpful for those folks, and I've got to be mindful about them, right? Like, it's the whole thing. Israel is given God in order to give it away.
Yeah.
We are given these things, given these opportunities. And so one of the ways, when we talked earlier about this notion that I want to be known in order to create, one of the most important ways that we create is creating with and for, but with those who are less fortunate than me. Carl Menninger was a world famous psychiatrist, person of faith, as it turns out. And he was asked routinely, what is it that you tell your patients who are depressed? If you could tell them one thing, and he said, I would tell them, lock your door, leave your house, and go find someone in your community who is less fortunate than you are, and do whatever it is that they need you to do for them. That's how you take care of your depression. I am the chief among sinners when it comes to being self-centered. Like, if you give me the opportunity to, like, have the day be for me, I'll take it. And it is an opportunity for us both to do the kind of work that we're doing right now, right here in this video, as a way for us to then be curious about where in my community can I give myself away in a way that actually it's going to create sacrifice for me, without recognizing that it is in sacrificing in those ways that I actually create joy. I actually create connection. And of course, the temptation is to hunker down, like I'm gonna hoard, I'm gonna keep from me. I can't, like, all the toilet paper I have to go buy. And this is an opportunity for us to do the things that we need to do for ourselves, for the purpose of allowing that overflow of generosity to people who need what we can offer.
It's such a good way to conclude our conversation, because we started with you saying we all have a desire to be known, but we've got to be creative. And of course, one of the ways to be known is also to be willing to know others. And in our creation, in our activities, our moving into the world, creating space for others to stand is often the self that we would like to be known for, right?
Exactly.
I tell people all the time that, we are who we're becoming. And one of the things that scares me right now in the pandemic is that the selves that we are becoming are unfortunately the selves that we currently are, frightened, fearful, anxious, depressed, nervous. Like, well, shoot, well, then we're becoming those people more and more. But if we are now people who are finding ways to help each other, reaching out, discovering new ways to be socially connected, despite the fact that we may not be bodily proximate, all of these different possibilities forward actually create how we are. Now we can be living toward the sorts of selves that we would like to be known as. And it reminds me of Maya Angelou, who has that great line where at the end of the day, most people will forget what you said. Most people forget what you even did, but they'll never forget how you made them feel. And so, whether it's in my own house or via Zoom with students and webinar, attendees around the world, or if it's, finding ways to put on a mask and go to the local breadline and be able to offer and volunteer, we're creating opportunities to let others feel, first and foremost, that they're not alone. And secondly, that they are loved and that we're going to be okay, even if it turns out lots of us aren't. without being callous at all, it's important that, again, that philosophical notion of memento mori, nothing essential has changed, right? Our
Right.
mortality has not suddenly become a reality. It's always been a reality. Again, one of those revealing moments. And yet, knowing each other and knowing ourselves as the mortal beings we are,
Yeah.
that's like
Yeah.
I say, that doesn't stop the requirement to make meaning. It actually
Yeah.
propels us into it ever more gratefully. So
Yeah.
yeah, I am grateful for your work, Curt. Thank you for your witness and your example.
Aaron, thanks so much. It's been a pleasure to be with you, and let's do this again this afternoon.
Hey, sounds good to me, man. I'll brew a new cup of coffee, right? So to
Okay.
everyone else, thank you as always for watching Two Philosophers, One Conversation. We always try to remind each other that philosophy is about the public good. And as we just said, we've got to do our best to make meaning in light of the fact that we are mortal beings. Have a great day. We'll see you next time.